All right, so welcome. Good to see so many faculty members here today. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be here, be able to at least provide you guys with some of my basic strategies and tips that I follow in the classroom. By the way, I don't know if you guys noticed, but when I came up here with the laptop, I got a bunch of stickers on it, which indicates that I'm probably from the computer science department. That's what we tend to do, is put some of those stickers on there. One of them came from the student club night we just had, which it says, "You're or nerd today, your boss tomorrow." Right? Kind of neat. So, consider that, I suppose. Along those lines, I was going to have you guys do a warm-up exercise, 20 push-ups, but I think we all walked up the stairs and now we're tired, so I won't make you do that. Let's move on to the next exercise. So we'll start out with an exercise, okay? And let's try to do the best we can on this one. I want you guys to consider, 1 to 2 items where if you've attended a presentation, maybe back to your days as a student, which is not too long ago for everybody in this room, I'm assuming, right? And so think about approaches that you've seen that presenter take that were unfavorable, and maybe some of the approaches that they took that were favorable in your mind. Okay, so let's try to do 1 to 2 of these items. You can do it mentally. I may call on you, but there will be a point to this soon enough. So please bear with me. Okay, and I'll give you about 1 minute. It's probably about a minute. So let's consider. Who wants to share an idea about something an approach that you saw in the past that you really appreciated and maybe use now within your own classroom environment? Does anybody want to share that with us? Anything particular that you've seen? We got an idea over here.
Well, we've seen it from both of you so far, humor throughout the presentation.
And I do agree with that. I mean, humor is just one of those ways where, it does lighten the mood a little bit. It gets students to probably start thinking about, okay, yeah, I mean, this is serious. We want to be focused, but it's also okay to have fun while you're learning. That's the key. What about a negative approach or an unfavorable approach?
Disorganized.
Disorganized. I absolutely agree with that. I also remember back to my days as a student, I remember I had a professor who was always just facing the whiteboard or the chalkboard and not really speaking to the audience. Okay, that in itself. So the whole point to all of this is just to consider, of course, take your past experiences, use them, whether or not they're negative or positive, and make sure that you either follow those positive experiences or don't do the negative ones. Okay, it's that simple in the end. And so I always try to think about that. No matter how long I've been teaching, I still won't forget those moments that have impacted me throughout my life. So you guys also consider as well. All right. Now, what I wanted to do first here was just give you guys some tips. Okay, what I follow, and of course you can take away whatever you want from this. First tip is you should enjoy yourself in the classroom. Okay, in some cases you think, well, it's hard to do that, but it shouldn't be. Okay, if you really enjoy what you're doing, you're passionate about the topic, it will show. And I think all of you guys will agree with this. Even in the engineering disciplines, we don't always have to be so rigid about the approaches that we take. And I think your students would also appreciate that. If you're slightly different than the norm on this, that's probably a good thing. Right? You'll understand that a little bit. They'll listen to you a little bit more as well. Active learning is a term we've all heard about. I certainly apply that in my classrooms. Does everybody know what this is and understand the concept of active learning, trying to get students involved, trying to get that feedback, maybe understand what they understand and what they don't, these kinds of concepts. I'm always interacting with students in classroom. Okay, and so I don't care if it's a large classroom, 250 students, my last class, about 250 students in there. I try to engage every single one of them, okay, to the best of my ability. I can ask a basic question, and I look around. A lot of times I get the blank stares, but what do I do to get them to open up? Well, I mean, first thing is I establish an environment where they don't necessarily have to feel embarrassed if they don't give you the best answer, and that's something I really do support. So at least they attempt to do it. Then I reinforce it and say something like, well, what happens if you give me that answer on an exam? Right? This is your first shot at it, so might as well do it now so you learn and don't do it on the exam, right? Just little strategies like that, little tips like that I think you guys could consider. Personality, I think is a big deal in lectures, right? The more that you guys can really press the topic and show that you are a human being, I think the students also appreciate that. Passion, enthusiasm, we talked about different mediums. So PowerPoints. If I was going to be up here for an hour and just showing you guys PowerPoints, I guarantee I'll start looking around and I'll see people looking at their nails and looking up at the ceiling and all this kind of stuff. Because it does get a little bit bland after a while. So what I like to do, I'll use PowerPoints, I'll use the whiteboard, I'll use the chalkboard, All these different types of mediums I think are useful. You could have handouts. Of course, if you have these complex diagrams, those are a good idea. At the same time, what I like to do is actually use some of the tools where they develop their homework with in class and provide live solutions. And I'll get back to that here in a second. All right. I like to foster a relaxed environment, okay, which means not that, okay, you know, we're kind of looking at this in a way where we're not really serious. That's not the case. Relaxed means focus to me. Okay, so if they're not so uptight, they're not so stressed out about everything that's going on, I think they do open up, they listen to what you have to say, they start buying into more of the topics that you're describing. And that's always one of my favorite approaches. And I do give that, get that feedback from students at times. Okay, they do feel like they can ask you questions. And what is this about being in the classroom? It's allow them to ask questions so that you can answer them, allow them to explore ideas so they feel like they can in fact do that. Okay. I always pause for questions in the classroom, and I kind of like this idea. Every once in a while, I'm going through a bunch of material, and even right now, go through a bunch of material. And if it's something that's really complex, I like to stop, and I say, hey guys, let's take a 30-second, a minute break, and really let that material absorb. Okay, it lets their mind sort of wander maybe for a second, then refocus. Because we've all been in the classroom where we see all of this information that has been provided to us, and then after about 20 minutes, our brains are crammed, we haven't had a break, it's hard to start, continue to follow after that point. I also encourage you to consider this in labs. If you have like a 3-hour lab session for your students, kind of a neat idea. All right, more tips for building rapport. Show that you care. Maybe that's obvious, but students want to know that you're there, you want them to be successful. I teach a lot of entry-level classes. In some cases, you hear the term, this is a weed out class, right? I never use that term. It's not the case. In entry-level classes, you have to recognize a lot of the students haven't been exposed to that kind of material before. And so you try to cultivate the environment where, obviously they can come in, they feel like you actually care about their needs, you actually care about their success, and they really appreciate that, okay? And that goes along with the fact that each individual in the classroom, even if you have 250 students, I don't view it just as a single entity, one large group. I try to look at each individual and say, hey, what can I do? What is working for you guys? Talk to me in office hours, send me emails, and that also helps to build a bit of this rapport. Okay? Yeah, it's a lot of work, right? But at the same time, really in the end, the students are what should matter here. And this one, every once in a while, if they're going to miss my class, and it is 250 students, I request that they send me an email. And not everybody will. But it's actually kind of neat to say, okay, I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm going to tell the professor I can't make it to class. And I do get those emails. Instead of just not showing up, not believing that I would know they're there, which a lot of times I actually know if students missing, they'll send me that email. Okay, accountability is a big deal, especially with these younger students, right? Okay. Any questions, comments? Just a few tips that I follow. I thought this was important, okay, for a strategy. How many of you guys, when you're teaching, you just have TAs assigned to your classes? Is that how it works a lot of times for you? Many cases. Well, there might be opportunities where, if you are entry-level type class, maybe something that is not too advanced, you could recruit your own undergraduate TAs who have taken the class and apply them as TAs to those entry-level classes. The reason why I point this out is undergraduates tend to be very passionate about the topic. Okay, this is kind of one of those positions where they can also consider they're pretty important. They can build on this position on the resume, and so these are all very appealing to the student. Within our department, we can assign credit to these students who decide to TA for one time, which is extra motivation. But you also don't want to necessarily have to worry about all the overhead of trying to train maybe your graduate TAs who've never really taken this kind of course, have a different background, and try to get them caught up to speed with the different guidelines and expectations in the class. So I find this very useful. Okay, so think about it, see if you can somehow integrate that into what you guys are doing in the classroom. And here's actually my favorite part about it. TAs, undergraduates, at least the ones that you end up selecting, you generally think are probably the more responsible students. They tend to cultivate this kind of environment where they'll help out the younger students. So maybe some of these senior level students make that connection with the younger students and they build that rapport, which is important. to know that freshmen are not isolated from the upperclassmen. Okay? The upperclassmen can provide them with insight into not only these entry-level classes, but other classes they'll take in the future. And so I think that tends to lead to more retention as well. And that's always a big issue, as you guys can imagine. All right, so let's move on. Now, some tools that I use. And of course, a lot of you guys know about Angel. But the reason why I use this tool is not necessarily for all the features that it has. I'll use it for the basics, and then I'll use other tools for other purposes in my classroom and so forth. But of course, one of my favorite things about Angel is that I can just send out emails to everybody in the class, no problem. And yes, there's a way to do that within Zeusys as well. Okay, but you want to find some sort of central platform where you guys can send out those emails. So I like this when I have some sort of topic or something that comes up and I need to be able to send it and let students know about it. The gradebook. Are you ever concerned about displaying grades and having personal information of the student being disseminated to other people? Probably to a certain extent. Okay, so we want to protect against that. Angel, of course, allows us to put in the gradebook, and only the student score for that particular student who logs in is what they can see. All right, so that's an advantage. But unfortunately, starting next semester, what do we know? We're going to transition to using Blackboard, which should be a very similar platform. It should have the same features. Homework submissions also key. If you have a lot of students, they can upload. I tend to try to stay away from using hard copies and paper as much as I possibly can, just because it's a little bit easier to manage. Also, if they have to upload to a system, you can tag the time. You can mark the time when they did that. So if you have any sort of late penalties, you can check against it pretty easily. Things to consider. Okay. So now slightly different. Classroom details. What do I do in my classroom? Well, I usually require students to bring laptop or a tablet. Okay, which should indicate we're probably going to be using some tools. And those tools are something they have to get very comfortable with. So the more often they see them, the more comfortable they're going to be using the tools. And in some cases, maybe it's a little bit difficult to say, hey, bring these tools with you. But I certainly think no matter what discipline you're in, there's always a possibility. Okay? And so just consider this idea. What I like to do is I'm going through a concept. And yes, I'm computer science department, so I'm teaching these computer science classes. We're building software. As I type out statements to build this software, I expect that students are also trying to type it out along with me. So not only have they seen it through me one time, but hopefully, as they type it in, it's going to reinforce these ideas just a little bit more. Okay? We're not only getting them to retain the information a bit better this way, we're also getting more exposure to that tool, which can have a lot of different features. And so when they're on their own time and they have to complete these assignments, once again, they feel a little bit better about it. Because I've also been in this situation where I was in a classroom, we're expected to use certain tools, but they were never really mentioned in the classroom. Right? You're just supposed to go out and try to figure it out on your own. Well, once again, you'll lose students that way if you don't at least provide this information. Okay. Sharing ideas, of course, listening to ideas. As I type out a solution, it's a good idea. Interaction, the act of learning. Once again, hardware. Okay, and this is something different. So within our department, yes, we can have basic hardware components that we practice on, ideas, circuits, all this kind of stuff. They can bring that to class as well. It's not just a laptop. They can physically have something in their hand where if I say, hey, let's try this idea, they try it to their own a board or hardware kit or tool that they have in front of themselves. So they get that instant feedback, maybe that instant gratification, which we understand is probably a pretty big deal nowadays. And so I always try to introduce this in the classroom. I don't make it just too theoretical. Okay, so whatever that means for your discipline, at least consider. All right. Tools, more tools. This particular tool, you guys probably don't care too much about, but it's part of an example. So if you're walking in a classroom, and even if it was something like an art discipline, okay, we have some sort of canvas, we lay out our ideas on it, we lay out the art. Well, a similar idea applies for us in our classroom within computer science. We have a tool called Visual Studio where we can start typing in our software, our programs. This tool in itself basically Every student's going to have an instance of it, which means we should probably make it available somehow where they don't have to necessarily pay too much money for it. Tech store is a good idea to direct them to. So I encourage you guys to try to use tools they can find through the tech store. I encourage you guys to try to use tools in their classrooms where they can find for free online, because they already have to pay so much for textbooks and whatever else, maybe some of the equipment like the laptops. And as part of this, how often have you heard students tell you they're working on a document and they happen to lose it, or it got corrupted, and so they couldn't submit their homework assignment? How many guys have heard this excuse before? I think all of us have been there. And maybe unfortunately it's happened to us. We should know better, right? So we back this stuff up. So one tool I like to use for backing up my changes, my documents, and controlling revisions is called Git. And this is something in particular we like within the software field, but you guys could also explore a similar tool. We can go back and make sure that any changes we made are undone if we didn't like those changes. If I lose a document or I corrupt a document, I just go back to this tool and I grab one that was there previously. Okay? I can also have multiple students working on some project, some document, and they can merge their changes together. Okay? Versus just saying, hey, I'm going to send out the document to you, work on it, send it back to me via email, work on it, and send it back to you via email, and so on, which gets pretty complicated after a while. It's not just very efficient. So think about that as well. Next tool. Okay? The social interaction that was mentioned here. So what I'm going to do here is provide you Visual Studio, this tool. You don't need to know too much about it, like I was saying, but I can type in programs with this tool. The neat thing about it is there are several members within our department who built and plug into this tool that allows students to interact with each other and share ideas. So what we have here is an activity feed, which is similar to what you'd find in Facebook. And I think that whenever you have something that's similar to Facebook, it's probably a pretty cool idea. I think a lot of students will start following and paying attention to what you're doing with that. And so effectively, what it looks like here is, you don't have to see this too much, but as they're building on this canvas, their art, their programs, you can have a bunch of users up on the right-hand side. You can post a discussion, and instantly, since this is a live stream, you're probably going to have somebody else be able to answer it fairly soon, and so they don't just get stuck on one problem and give up after a while. They get that, once again, instant feedback, that gratification that they're looking for. Kind of a neat idea. And I know for other classes that in some cases we have instructors that use Facebook. They really do for sharing activity, which is a good idea. So I'd say consider something like that. Social interaction, I think, is a large part of what the new generation of students appreciate. Of course, sharing ideas in general is good, but you only want to go so far in some cases. My concern here would be that maybe one student would post their entire solution here so another student could grab it. With this kind of tool, we can filter that. So you can only show so much. On Facebook, it might be a little bit of a different story, right? And so you explore these kinds of things. Once again, just consider. All right, so the tool is called Ozbide. The feedback, major advantage, the feed is live. Disadvantage, I suppose, is if you're not connected to the internet. Okay, you lose that line, you're not going to be able to get this feedback, which makes sense, I think. I'll start wrapping it up. I think I'm running out of time. Clickers. So someone wanted me to mention this possibly, why I don't use clickers. And so here's the problem. At least with the first version of clickers, you could only do multiple choice-like questions, right? I mean, I don't use them, but that's generally the idea. And so I started thinking about that. Yes, if you have the right question to ask, maybe you can do it in a multiple choice format. But if I'm building up software, it's really hard to do that. If you guys are working with art on Canvas, how can you say that this is correct with a multiple choice question? It's hard to do. You agree with that? And so I tend to stay away from it. And plus I've heard from a lot of students, they gripe about it a little bit. They say, well, I don't necessarily find it that useful. Yes, it tracks my attendance, which is probably good. It tries to engage me. But in the end, I've heard some negative feedback about it. All right, we'll stop there. I think I'm out of time. So there's plenty of stuff, but just a few tips for you to consider. This is what I follow in my classroom. Any questions? We got one. Bill.
Maybe someone in the room can comment about, will Canvas support the social interaction that Andy's talking about at all? Blackboard, excuse me. Thank you, thank you. Will Blackboard, the new learning management system, have a feature like that? Does anybody know?
I believe that Blackboard has a feature like that. I don't know if we're starting out with that feature.
Okay.
But we are, I know that actually our new survey tool, Explorance Blue, they've also built some sort of feature like that that I know Dave Slay's been talking about, which is a separate thing. So, so bottom line is, I'm not exactly sure at this point, but I do think that that's an area that we're looking at, something that would be outside of Facebook, that would be inside of WSU,
Right,
that would
right.
allow for social interaction.
Okay, so any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, for the GitHub, it's as long as we posted this online for everybody, is there like a private for the group?
That's right. So there are public and private repositories that you can post to. Generally, the private repositories will cost you money. The public ones are free. Okay. So if you're concerned about them seeing ideas and documents, whatever else, you have to be careful where you post it. But at least it's a step in the right direction for managing those revisions